All right, we are up to about the halfway point here, lecture number 5 in Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Luke. And now, what becomes especially clear in this particular lecture is what Steiner is doing. He's essentially a neo-Gnostic, as his whole worldview here, with regard to his Christ myth, is based on a fusion of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity. That's what's going on here. And now note that Steiner was not the first to do this, maybe the first in our civilization, but he reminds me very strongly of the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani. Mani was born in the Parthian Empire. The Parthians had taken back from the Greek Seleucids control over the Persians, although the Parthians themselves were not Zoroastrians. But they were masters. They were basically nomadic horsemen, masters of riding from horseback and shooting with compound bow and arrow with deadly accuracy from horseback, which is why the Romans had such a tough time with them. So the Achaemenids had been Zoroastrian, and scholars believe that Zarathustra lived 500 BC. Many of them do, not all of them. I agree with the date 1000 BC. The Gathas go back to 1000 BC, so he's definitely 1000 BC. Steiner thinks 6000 BC, which was the Greek date. Nobody buys that except for obscure scholars like Mary Sedegast, for instance, in her brilliant book When Zarathustra Ruled. So the Achaemenids had been Zoroastrian, and it survives amongst the Seleucids, and then the Parthians get rid of it, and then the Sasanians come back in and they restore Zoroastrianism. But Mani lived in the 3rd century, around 250 AD, under the Parthians, and his whole worldview was a deliberate synthesis of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity. He traveled to India. He may have been kicked out of Persia and exiled, we're not sure. Then he traveled to India, and there he studied Indian philosophy and became especially enamored of Buddhism. And he already knew Zoroastrianism, and so he was building a fusion of these ideas. He proclaimed himself as the Paraclete, which is an individual, a mysterious personage that is announced only in the John Gospel, and we'll do the Steiner's commentary on the John Gospel next. So the Paraclete is very mysterious. Christ announces that the Paraclete will come after me as the Comforter. It means the Comforter. Nobody knows what the fuck he's talking about, but a future Christian prophet, nobody knows. It's disputed. But Mani said he was the Paraclete. And the other thing about Mani was that he believed in reincarnation. Another thing that brings him very close to Rudolf Steiner. I don't think Steiner is the reincarnation of Mani. I know what Steiner's past incarnations were, and Mani wasn't one of them. We'll discuss Steiner's past incarnations in another lecture. They're a little weird, as as always with Steiner, but that's what makes him interesting and fun. So this is Mani, and a number of his texts have survived, quite a few of them actually, but I don't think any of them are complete. I may undertake a special study of Mani and do a series on him. He was also said, like the Buddha, to be born from his mother's chest, in this case, not her side. That is a clear attempt to link him back to the Buddha. And in some cases, I've heard some accounts where he says that he is the reincarnation of the Buddha and also the reincarnation of Christ. So I'm not sure about the specifics of that at this point. And he was also supposedly crucified. He was put into prison by an emperor, I forget his name, Shapur something, who took a disliking to him, regarded him as a heretic, and in some accounts he's hung from a tree. I've seen Persian paintings of him hanging from like a palm tree. Again, a deliberate attempt. He probably was not hung from a tree. He probably died in prison. But again, there's a deliberate attempt to link him to Christianity, just as the birth from his mother's chest is an attempt to link him to Buddhism. So his religion lasted for a while, but I don't think it ever fully took hold. Its creation myth is interesting too, because the creation myth is essentially an adaptation of the Zoroastrian creation myth, in which we have a realm of absolute light and a realm of darkness governed by demons. And there are various personages in the realm of light, such as the Anthropos and the Holy Spirit. These are different personages in another being. And the Anthropos suits himself up in an armor made out of light and descends down into the realm of darkness to do battle there with the demons, but he fails, and the demons eat his armor of light. They rip it off him, and they eat it. That's how light becomes trapped in darkness, according to the Manichaean myth. That's why it's trapped in everything. And you liberate, in Manichaeanism, it's a process of liberating trapped particles of light. There are higher concentrations of light in fruit, for instance. So you want to eat fruit to liberate the light particles. And the light particles are gradually liberated, and they fill up every month into the moon. And as the moon gets full, it's full of liberated light particles that good Manichaeans have liberated, and it gets transferred to the sun, and it empties again. And it just keeps refilling. It's wonderful how myth makes sense out of the world in its own way. We get these alternate explanations of things. And then, so the Anthropos has to be rescued by the Holy Spirit, who some accounts think the handshake originates from this. He leans his hand down into the realm of darkness and pulls the fallen Anthropos back up into the world of light. There's also an apocalypse at the end of the world to accord with the book of Revelation. So that's basically it. But the similarities with Steiner are pretty striking, so I think we have to regard him very much as a neo-Gnostic, and the myth that he's creating here is something of the kind that would have been done by a prophet like Mani. So then getting back to the narrative, and this gets very complicated, but it's not hard to follow if you pay attention to it. So we have the two boys, the Solomon boy from the Matthew Gospel, and we have the Nathan boy, who's a descendant from the priestly line, in the Luke Gospel, the Solomon boy being a descendant from the kingly line. And Steiner says, so what has happened here is that what the Christ child, or let's say the Jesus boy, inherits from the Solomon boy is a cosmic wisdom because Zarathustra has reincarnated in the Solomon boy, and he contributes a knowledge of the outer world and the cosmos, of cosmic things, like the Amisha Spentas, which are the prototypes for the angels, actually, in the Western tradition. They come from Zoroastrianism. And with the inheritance from the Nirmanakaya of the Buddha's body fusing with the Nathan boy's astral body, he inherits an inwardness, depths of feeling and warmth. So Steiner recaps and says that, now recall that he had said that Zarathustra had two pupils who were then reincarnated later on as Tot Hermes, the founder of the third post-Atlantean epoch, and that individual inherits Zarathustra's astral body, or let's say he donates his astral body to Tot Hermes, and then he donates his etheric body to Moses. And these are the two characters who are instrumental in the Egyptian civilization. And eventually he donates his physical body, of course, via the Nathan boy, whose body he vacates so that the Christ ego at the moment of baptism can descend down into it. So this is a very complicated myth, very complex, but it's well thought through and very consistent. Steiner's got everything covered. He says, for instance, that the reason we have two different annunciations, in the Solomon text we have the annunciation to Joseph. But this is, of course, in Steiner's myth, a different Joseph and Mary, who also lived nearby in Nazareth, from the Joseph and Mary of the Nathan boy, to whose mother Mary, the Annunciation, more famously appears. You hardly ever see, I noticed the iconotype of the Annunciation to Joseph is almost non-existent. I'm sure it's been painted, but it's not particularly noted. But Steiner says there's a reason for this, because it is through the paternal line that one inherits will and power. These are paternal motivations that are proper to the kingly line of Solomon that this boy is descended from. So naturally the Annunciation occurs to the paternal, the father, whereas from the maternal line the Annunciation occurs to Mary with the Nathan boy, because he inherits the intense depths of feeling and emotion which one inherits, according to Steiner, from one's mother. A certain degree of wisdom, but not what we would regard as intellect. The Solomon boy is intellectually gifted and precocious, whereas the Nathan boy would have been regarded as backward, but a very warm, feeling, compassionate, loving child. So this is the reason for the two different annunciations. Steiner is also careful to point out that now, with regard to the narrative in Luke, we have two annunciations there also, one to the mother of John the Baptist, to Elizabeth, and of course the one to Mary, and that these births would have taken place several months apart from the birth of the Matthew boy because of Herod's massacre of the innocents that took place in the Matthew Gospel that drove the boy and his parents into Egypt, which is where Zarathustra, according to Steiner, wanted to go back to visit because he had strong connections with Egypt via Moses, donating his etheric body to Moses and his astral body to Tot, basically, the equivalent of Greek Hermes. So that's why he goes, one of the reasons why he wants to go back to Egypt. But there's a massacre of the innocents. So John couldn't have been born 6 months apart from the Nathan Jesus. Neither one of them could have been born. If all the males 2 years and under were killed in Bethlehem, there would have had to been a lapse of a few months between the birth of the Matthew Solomon boy and the Luke Nathan boy. And then so we have the issue of John the Baptist then, who is a very important personage as well. And he represents the guardian of the old ways, the old law that has been forgotten, which of course all the prophets all along, ever since Elijah, had been railing about, forgetting the covenant, forgetting the old laws. And so consequently, note that his parents, Elizabeth and Zechariah, are both very old. Elizabeth had been barren all of her life and was vouchsafed a pregnancy we're not told exactly how old she was, but that signifies the fact that John is born from an old soul. He's representing the old ways and the old tradition, whereas the Mary of the Nathan boy, it was very important that she be young, because the boy, his soul is young. Remember that he has inherited a part of the etheric body from Adam as a provisional ego until the union takes place here, which gets even more complicated. So what that then happens is that we find the boy teaching at the age of 12 in the temple, to everyone's astonishment. And what has happened is that the Buddha's astral body at about this time, about the age of 12, the Nirmanakaya, as Steiner calls it, borrowing a term and using it in a different meaning, as the Nirmanakaya is the historical Buddha, but let's just grant him that. So he's uniting the Nirmanakaya with the boy's astral body at this time, and then the Solomon boy, the ego of Zarathustra, leaves the Solomon boy and transmigrates, and they're living nearby, both families, transmigrates into the Nathan boy. The Nathan boy has no siblings, by the way. He's an only child of this Joseph and Mary. But now, this Mary dies. The Mary that gives birth, the one to whom the Annunciation occurs, in both cases die. The Mary individuality dies, leaving him orphaned on the maternal side, but the Joseph character is still there. And on the Solomon side, Joseph has died, also the one to whom an Annunciation had occurred. Note that in both cases. And he has died. And after the ego of Zarathustra leaves the Matthew boy, the Solomon boy, then he dies. But that had been the family. That Mary had the four brothers of what will be the four brothers of Jesus and the two sisters. So that was a very large family that she was left with. And both families unified. So the Mary in Matthew unifies, or I suppose marries the Joseph in Luke. And so they get together. And then we get the fusion of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism within this child now, who is a rather remarkable being, as at the age of 30 he will then receive the ego of the sun god, the Christ being that will come that Zoroaster had talked about as Ahura Mazda, the sun god, will descend down into this being so that you end up with a very spiritually sophisticated and complex organism that's as complex as anything in physical biological evolution. As we know from Lynn Margulis, the cells of our bodies are made up of cells within cells within cells that have endosymbiotically joined together. The mitochondria in our cells that allow us to respire oxygen were once free-living bacteria. And as a matter of fact, they have their own DNA that's separate from what's in the nucleus. Same thing with plants, the chloroplasts there that give them the ability to photosynthesize were once separate organisms. They were separate bacteria that have fused together. And of course, eventually the cells join together to form protozoa, and then larger and larger multicellular organisms till the Cambrian explosion. So biological evolution is endosymbiotic and holonomic. The holonomic image is the circle with circles, 3 circles within it, then a set of maybe 3 more within each of those, and so on. Spiritual evolution, as Steiner presents it, works the same way. It's equally as complex and full of such holonomic structures that get enfolded, etheric bodies, astral bodies, egos that get enfolded, until in the Christ you have this anomaly, this totally unique being who is the fusion now. And of all of this, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and now he's inaugurating Christianity. And he's, of course, going to inherit the teachings of John the Baptist, which, as Steiner will get to in the 5th Gospel, connects him to the Essenes, since he believes that John the Baptist was an Essene. I think that's what he says. Anyhow, he does have Christ being initiated into the mysteries of the Essenes as well. And the Essenes, of course, did have the myth of 2 separate messiahs that would appear, not one, a kingly messiah and a priestly messiah. And here, with Steiner's idea of the Christ child, it appears unified in one being, both types of messiahs. So he's unifying everything together. So then there's that family. And then Steiner says that the Joseph, who has survived on the Nathan side, also dies, leaving Mary a widow with these kids, a very large family. And so that's the situation. He will also say, if that wasn't complicated enough, he will also say that at the moment of Christ's baptism, not only does the Christ being descend, but the soul of his original mother Mary, who has died around the age of when he's 10, 11, 12, I don't know, that soul transmigrates back into the soul of his stepmother Mary, that has come over from the Matthew Gospel, let's say, which is his stepmother Mary, but the original soul of his birth mother Mary descends down and takes up residence within this Mary and retransforms her into a virgin. That's what Steiner says. I'm just relaying information. You know, a lot of you guys see a lot of comments where people get pissed off. And it's a sure sign when somebody gets indignant and jumps on your comments and says, no, you have that wrong. It means that I've hit a truth, or Steiner rather has hit a truth. And they're scared that something true has taken place. Maybe not literally true, but certainly spiritually. There are profound spiritual truths in this myth. As I said last time, there's no such thing as an untrue myth. And I love how people get indignant and upset about their precious views, and they start pointing out, well, you know, what's wrong here with Steiner? Why are you so threatened that what he says might be true? Why does that threaten you? Obviously, it's a sign of the power of Steiner as a spiritual thinker and a mythopoeic individual, creating his own myths of very immense, enormous power. I've noticed that the views on my series here have gotten less and less over time, and that really is too bad, because these are individuals who think that the information that I'm relaying is meant to be literally true, that I really believe that there are 2 Jesus children. Of course I fucking don't believe that. I mean, people are so stupid. There's a lot of intelligent people in the audience here. There's a lot of idiots too who think what I'm relaying is the gospel truth. Of course it isn't. The Gospels are a myth. Christ didn't walk on water. None of that stuff happened. That's myth. And what I'm relaying with Steiner here is also myth. Don't be so threatened by this stuff. Enjoy the poetry here. This is like recounting Tolkien's Silmarillion. I wouldn't sit here and recount the Silmarillion like this, and I may do that at one point. And then have people get indignant. Well, no, it's not this way. Actually, the Anglo-Saxons believe, shut the fuck up, okay? Enjoy the myth making and just leave it at that. So we'll end with that.